Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv, who basically, I feel like now, when I say, I start saying one of those words and it all just like comes out in exactly the same form. It's a truly odd experience saying the same thing into a microphone. I don't know, twice a week, once to twice a week for going on 9 years. What a wild time. I don't know why I said that, but here we are. So today's episode, I was kind of going back and forth with what to give you all this week. I hope you enjoyed last Friday's episode with Joel Christensen on the Iliad. Oof. That's one I wish I'd released earlier. It just kind of became lost, and we recorded so many a few months back. And I've had trouble listening to myself talk. But yeah, that episode was just very powerful and I think really necessary. And we didn't go as deep into the Iliad as originally planned, but I think that's because too many things are too relevant today. So I'll just say I really hope you liked that episode. And then I was going back and forth on what to do today. We have lots of conversations still coming up. So lots of new things happening there. And I thought, I could give you all another Thebaid episode, which have been getting more and more fun. Or, well, you have all given me loads more questions to answer for another Q&A episode. And since I have so many, including lots of voice notes, because I just knew as soon as I got one or two, you'd all start sending them in, which I'm so thrilled about. I'm going to answer some of your questions today. I'm not even going to be able to get through all of the additional ones I have, including voice notes. So if you send something in and I don't get to it, I likely still will. The questions are a little harder because sometimes it's just that I've been asked them 100 times. But the voice notes, there's a couple more that I haven't gotten to. So we'll get into those next time. But this time, there's lots of fascinating things to talk about. You've all asked really interesting questions that I'm excited to answer. So we're going to dive straight into that. And also, God damn it, I'm going to answer the question that I put in the title of the last Q&A and then didn't get around to answering, because why are all of the heroes always crying to their mothers? Because women are better and softer and more empathetic. Now, there's better reasons. It's fine. Heroes crying to their mothers and deconstructing gender. A Q&A episode. All right, we are starting off with the question I missed last time. This is from Rachel from Olympia, which I know you mean Washington, but it still feels very appropriate. Rachel says, I love listening to you reading while I work. Recently I started the Iliad again and I was struck by something. Now I can't unsee it or stop laughing. The amount of times characters have something go wrong and immediately go to their mothers. Achilles gets insulted and his ego bruised, literally goes to the water and cries for his mommy. Venus gets hurt protecting her mortal son, hightails it home and vents to her mom, who reminds her that mortal men ain't shit. Ares sees his sister breaking the rules. Well, he can't go to mama, so he tattles to his daddy. Hector and his brothers are getting their asses kicked. The smartest one says to go ask mom for help. Now, I love this question, obviously, and I wish that I had some particularly insightful answer for it, but I think there's a few things happening here. I think the primary one is just the recognition that women often had, let's say, like, minds for this type of issue, whether it is that their mothers are comforting, are just like a warm presence that they need at that time, or whether it's because their mothers have the intellect, or just, I think that there's kind of an acknowledgement going on here that women provide counsel for different things than men. And so it's just this general understanding that like women are the people you go to for certain issues. Now, obviously, like it that gets blown up a little bit when you just imagine that it's a lot of like complaining to their moms. And I think that is also partially coming from just the timeless nature of like going to your mom for help. I mean, I don't know if it's just me. Obviously, people have very different relationships with their mother. I completely respect that. But like, I'm 37 and sometimes I still call my mom if I like need help with something, or I'm having like an emotional breakdown and I just need to like immediately cry to someone. Is that fair to her? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. She chose to have me, so here we are. So I think there's also this acknowledgement that women are this carer. They do play that kind of caretaking, that warm role, even in the ancient world. Like, women may not have had the same freedoms or overall equality. They didn't. But there is still obviously this acknowledgement of the importance of that familial relationship, the importance and just like the particular things that a woman can provide to their child, that the mother can provide to their child, that a father is going to have a different perspective or a different way of dealing with it, any of those things. Like, I think at the simplest form, this is just a really nice example of how much humanity stays the same. That this is just a really ancient example of like people going to their moms for comfort. And again, not universal, unfortunately. But I think it's a really interesting examination of that idea that throughout time, women have provided this specific type of role for their children that the father just doesn't provide. On a purely fun and silly level, though, like, it's joyful it's joyful that it happens in the text, but it's also delightful to remind the type of people, that say we were talking about last week on my episode with Joel and Michaela on the Iliad. Like, it's really nice to remind the type of people who conceptualize the Iliad and by extension, like, war more broadly as this purely like honorable and important and like, just inherently like good thing that they do. Like, I don't know. It's the people who love war and think that the Iliad is like pro-war in any way. Like, I like to be able to remind them that, like, well, it also involves your strongest hero crying to his mom like constantly. And like, that's human. And that's this realization that like the Iliad is not a story about good guys and bad guys. The Iliad is not a story about just like good versus evil or anything like that. The Iliad is a story about real people dealing with their lives, their issues, their whatever is happening around them, just like the humanity of it all. And I think the examples of all of these like big, strong men going crying to their mothers is like a really good evidence for the fact that it's just this timeless story of like humanity. Mostly featuring men, because patriarchy still, All right, we're going to intersperse this with a audio question because we have some fun ones.
Hi Liv, my name is Morgan. I'm from Nebraska, so the butt crack middle of the United States. You actually answered one of my questions a couple of years ago in an anniversary episode, and I recently have been listening to the 8-year anniversary episode, which is what prompted me asking this. Anyhow, my question is just, I am planning on doing my kind of big project at the end of my university courses on Helen of Troy and the archetype of the bad woman, and kind of the bad wife particularly. And so I'm really interested, I suppose this is less of a question, and more of just a prompt, but your thoughts on that connection between Helen and the bad wife, and also her connection to Clytemnestra and their being from Sparta, which obviously notoriously is a little bit more liberating for women in the ancient world, not necessarily a ton, but I don't know, that connection between the warrior likeness of Sparta, that association, I mean, that reputation, and then the rights for women there, and then kind of these characters of, because you've got Clytemnestra and Helen as both like the bad wives. And yeah, that is my question. Thank you so much for all that you do. Bye.
Morgan, I really like this question prompt, whatever. I hope I have some helpful information, but the thing I really just want to bring your attention to, because I think focusing on Helen and this wider idea maybe of like the bad wife, bad woman is so interesting. But the thing is, you have to be able to bring in Penelope because, oof. So, I mean, I would say like it's a little easier for me to talk about the comparison, the idea of like a good wife, bad wife, with Clytemnestra. Helen, it's definitely a great example, but the first things that come to my mind are what's happening in the Odyssey. Surprise, surprise, because it's like literally all I'm doing right now. So everything is about the Odyssey in this moment. But in that case, like Clytemnestra is really flaunted as this bad wife, and Helen by then is like oddly like completely forgiven, and like everything is kind of like it didn't happen, which is sort of its own absolutely wild thing. And then you can kind of, so like in the Odyssey, right, like when Helen reappears, she's in Sparta, she's the queen with Menelaus, like nothing ever happened, but also like surprise, she's incredibly good at like magical potions. Like she's a straight up pharmacist at this point. She is essentially a witch. Like we get this idea that she can brew magical kind of potions in the same vein that Cersei can. And that's so interesting. And then simultaneously she's like brewing this potion, but also like we're to forget that like the whole war was about her, but at the same time like she also references it. I don't know, it's so interesting. So I would really look at the Odyssey and the Helen there. And then particularly you have to look at the ways that Helen and Clytemnestra and Penelope specifically, all three of those are compared to each other in specifically the Odyssey most of all, in these ways that are like unbelievably interesting. Like Penelope is always the good wife, right? She's waiting for Odysseus. Clytemnestra is always the bad wife. She didn't wait for her husband and then killed him when he came home. He deserved it. It's fine. And then Helen is kind of this like odd person in the middle where we don't get a lot of background. It's still pretty unclear what the consensus was, if there was one, about like whether she went to Troy by choice or by force. Like we just really have like her living pretty comfortably in Troy during the Iliad, where she seems to like everybody well enough, and like she doesn't like the horror that it's causing, but otherwise like things are pretty okay. And then also like when she's back in Sparta with her husband, like nothing ever happened. Like we don't have any kind of, we do have like a bit of interior thought about her time in Troy, where we get this idea that at the end she was like, now I'm ready to go home. Like it's gotten pretty bad. But like otherwise we really don't know. And that's so interesting. But then we have simultaneously in that bit, which is called the Telemachy, right? Because it's like the first 4 books of the Odyssey are all about Telemachus and his travels around and talking to these people and learning. And we also have in those moments like Telemachus learns how Agamemnon died, and he learns it via Menelaus, and then also Nestor, though. So we have all of these people like shit-talking Clytemnestra and like talking in these kind of vague forms of like what exactly she did. And they're so often, well, I guess in those cases, they're just like about how terrible Clytemnestra is for what she did to Agamemnon. But then flash forward in book 11, we have Odysseus in the underworld, right? And then at one point, he meets up with Agamemnon, and he's like, oh, how'd you die? And Agamemnon's like, oh my god, my bitch of a wife did it. And he goes on and on about how terrible his wife is and all of this shit. We have absolutely no reasoning presented for why she did it, which makes me kind of furious, because I'm currently writing it, and like in the Odyssey, we don't actually know why she hated him, which makes me really mad, because she has a really good reason to kill her husband. I mean, he was a piece of shit for lots of reasons. But when he's in the underworld, he is making these connections between Clytemnestra and Penelope like very explicit. And I think he might talk about Helen too, so hopefully you can like kind of weave that in. But like, ooh, I want everyone, like normally I'm not, posting a question that's like so directly for somebody's like, I mean, I do notorious to say I don't help with homework, but then sometimes people send me a voicemail and it like really resonates and I want to talk about it. So I guess sometimes I do. But if you send me an individual email to help you with your homework, I'm not going to do it because my podcast is your homework. But there's just so much happening with those characters and it's so interesting. I'm not great at like archetypes. I don't know. I'm bad with like that kind of like putting those things into boxes. I don't want them in boxes. Like to me, and I think more truthfully that it's like a weird Western idea to like put them in boxes. Like it's like very Joseph Campbell archetype, whatever. Whereas it's like, no, these are like individual stories by individual people. Like they don't, humanity does not need to be put in these archetypal whatever boxes. So I'm bad with that, but I do think generally like this topic, this question of like the good women is so interesting. As for how it connects to Sparta, I'm a little bit less insightful, unfortunately. And that's partially like there's a lot of things at play. And hopefully this will be helpful. Firstly, before I forget to say this into the microphone, anyone who's interested in Helen, I haven't read this entire book, but I'm willing to bet it's a pretty good resource. There is a book called Helen of Troy by Bettany Hughes, which is like a huge honkin' thing. I've used it for sourcing on a like very old Helen episode now. But I bet it would be really interesting. And because the thing about Sparta, I mean, there's lots of things you can learn about Sparta. And there's just, the problem is like the question of so here's the thing. So the Iliad and the Odyssey obviously are the oldest Greek works that we have, right? And because of that, like there's a lot of disagreement about like when the stories kind of became solidified into what we have now. There's a theory that I believe I remember from my first episode with Joel Christensen. And I again, hope I'm right, but I'm pretty sure it was him who kind of presented this idea that obviously the Iliad and the Odyssey were being told via oral storytellers for hundreds of years, right? But it probably wasn't until around the Archaic period, probably in Attica, in Athens specifically, where some version of that story was eventually kind of selected for canon and written down. Now, it was probably written down purely for recording purposes, not because anyone would just sit down and read it. There wasn't really a practice of like just sitting down and reading. Most people were illiterate, and it was really more about like telling the story, right? Like saying it out loud. You didn't just like sit and read. And so the likelihood is that like when it did get eventually like put down into a written form, it also just kind of like sat there for a long time. But what that means is that there's a lot of questions, and I hope I don't just like complicate it because like obviously, I mean, this is just me like pointing out issues. Hopefully it's like easy to navigate. It's been a long time since I had to write anything academic, thank fuck. But there's a lot of things to be questioned about what these cultures looked like while the story was being developed. And so all of that is to say, like, I'm hesitant to say anything concrete about Sparta at that time, because the Sparta that we know, one, as you likely know from my series, the Spartan Mirage, the Spartans like were really good at propaganda, and we have not a great idea of like what their culture was definitely like according to them. We have a lot of like disparate thoughts, and like they also didn't tend to work with a lot of like stone buildings and material, which means like very little survives from Sparta. And so I'm just hesitant to say much about the Spartan culture around when the story itself was being developed. We don't really know if they were like a particularly military-based culture at that time, because that's definitely coming later. We don't know what kind of rights women had, but that's pretty true of like across the Greek world at that time. But that's all to say, like, mythologically, Sparta does not have the same associations as historically, and that's what interests me. Like, mythologically, the associations with Sparta are essentially all revolving around Helen and her family, right? Like Leda and Tyndareus, and Zeus as the father of some of them, and, you know, born of eggs and whatever, and her twin brothers, Castor and Polydeuces. Like, there's a lot mythologically, like, that is kind of the focus, but at the same time, we also don't have a lot of connections between Helen and Clytemnestra as like siblings, which is sort of interesting in itself. And I don't know, basically, this is just me kind of rambling, but I think it's so interesting, and I think this general question about like good women, bad women, whatever, particularly in Homeric epic, is so interesting. Like, it's clearly something I've been thinking about constantly as I like dig so deep into the Odyssey, and I'm I'm considering, I'll just say this for everyone too. So like, if you like this idea and you heard this, like, let me know that you like it. But I've been considering what I can do with the Odyssey as I work through it for this children's book, because there are so many things I am like, I wouldn't say learning necessarily, but like realizing or like making these connections, whatever, that are so fucking interesting. And I'm just kind of looking at how I can start revisiting the Odyssey in the podcast, so I can kind of, I just want to share all of this because I'm really learning so many things that like can't make it into a kid's book, but are so interesting. And they're also, I'm still looking into it, but there might be like a much newer translation that I can read aloud. And so basically, if you're listening to this and you would like to hear another reading of the Odyssey and or a further breakdown of like what's happening there, particularly with some of the more, I don't want to say problematic, but just like really interesting ideas. Like there's a lot to be said about Polyphemus and colonization, as like Michaela and I kind of touched on, but there's so much more to be said. There's so much to be said about these like good and bad women and what makes that. And I don't know, we're going to get into some more Odyssey questions, I believe, in this Q&A. So I've already talked for long enough. But let me know if you like that idea, because I would also love that. All right, we got another audio question incoming.
Hi, so you had a question on the 22nd of July about why a lot of goddesses were portrayed as, well, virgins, and you said it was more about how they weren't married. But part of me's wondering, is there also an aspect of, well, you think about how with men they had this concept that if you were the receiver, you were less of a man. So would a woman and goddess be regarded as less capable to be a strong fighter if they were, well, penetrated, I guess? I wondered if it's about that as well as the whole unmarried status thing, basically. It's my vague question.
Okay, I love that this question is kind of like a follow-up to one I posted recently, so I wanted to make sure we get to it. I think this is such an interesting like question / clarification, and I think in large part you're right. Like that is a connection being made. This idea of particularly Athena, I would say, because and Artemis actually. Yeah. Hestia, I think, is like another type of virgin, and I think there's too much else going on when it comes to Hestia's character. Like she's like a whole separate question. But Athena and Artemis as these quintessentially quote unquote virgin goddesses. And remember, if you haven't listened to the last Q&A episode, everyone, and you're confused right now, go listen to that, because I went into much more detail about like what that really means or meant. And I mean, obviously a lot of this is my theorizing based on a heavy amount of knowledge. But I think this is definitely connected. I think there is this, yeah, I mean, whether it was sort of intentional and like whether they were kind of cognizant of it or not, I think that's what's going on here. Is I think that these goddesses are who they are and are virgins because of all of these things kind of going on. So like, yeah, there is this idea that they have this kind of like masculine energy, right? Like both of these goddesses, like Athena is a warrior, and Artemis is a hunter. And both of those things are obviously traditionally quote unquote like male activities. And so I think it definitely is saying a lot that these characters are conceived as quote unquote virgins. And like I said last week, virgin did not have the same like Christian connotations. It definitely still had like some icky purity kind of connotations, but in large part it was this idea that you didn't have children, you weren't married. And therefore like it's part of it is also like keeping them not literally prepubescent, but like a little bit. Like there is this kind of idea of like Peter Pan kind of vibes. Like they don't grow up, they don't continue on and do the like quote unquote normal things that women do. They stay this kind of virginal state, and it's more about lifestyle and overall youthfulness than it is like this question of like, yeah, virginity, like we think of it. But I definitely think that there is something coming in here about penetration, because yeah, the ancient Greeks had like, I almost had a real hard on for penetration. So, I mean, they did. But like they had this real weird mentality around what it meant to be penetrated. And it was like, you know, it made you less of a man. It signified a youthfulness, a kind of like, because when it came to, you know, the relationships with Erastes and the Eromenos, right, the sort of male romantic, quote unquote, relationships that were very commonplace in ancient Greece, you know, that is coming along with this idea of like a young kind of mentee vibe who is also the penetrated, right? And it's sort of this rite of passage. And then when that person gets old enough, they swap places and they become the penetrator, like they become the other side of it. And so there's definitely like a lot going on with that idea of like penetration and subservience, whatever. So I think there's definitely a connection there, whether or not it's like explicit or was super intentional. But you're not wrong. You're not wrong. It's there. All right. And we have actually a written in question that I think connects with this quite well. And this question comes from May, who says, in learning a bit about Tudor era / early modern theater, an expert revealed that the idea of gender for AMAB individuals was more fluid, and that boys were flat out seen as a different gender than men, differentiating in humoral medicine by their ability to grow a beard. I know in some ancient Greek and Roman texts, it does put emphasis on beards or lack of them on male characters, and I'm curious if this belief about gender fluidity back in these times, thoughts. Okay. No, I think this is so interesting. I read it poorly, so I apologize, but the point got across. This is so interesting, and I think ultimately there is something similar happening there. I want to say that I've not like read that anywhere inherently or like with explicit evidence, but I also think that this is something that like is probably more theoretical generally, because they didn't really like record stuff in that sort of gender realm for us to look at. Like, we don't know how many genders they explicitly conceptualized, as far as I know. Maybe we do, but I don't know. I don't think so. But basically they did, I mean, this goes along with what I was just saying about the Erastes-Eromenos relationships, right? The sort of mentor older man who is penetrating the younger man in these relationships. And I think that is suggestive that there is something in this realm going on. You're also quite right about the beard situation. Whether or not a man had a beard or could grow a beard was, in a way, at least, a very clear identifier of like, this is a man. And if somebody didn't have a beard, they were conceptualized as younger and not like explicitly a different gender, but there was definitely like a lot of like a dichotomy going on between this like kind of young man who couldn't grow a beard and an older man who could. But there's also something like that happening when it comes to the women, and it connects right in with this idea of some of them being quote unquote virginal, because I think that's also something happening with women, is that young women, a sort of pre-marriageable age, but also just generally if they were not married, I think there is something going on with the conceptualizing of gender as something different. So like Artemis is my example for this, because Artemis is obviously a woman. She's a protectress of young girls. She's a virgin, but she is always conceptualized as being kind of young, youthful, sort of ageless, similar to Athena, but in that way where she is more, it's almost like in that case, youthfulness is also this kind of like freedom in the world and from society. So the thing I'm connecting, and not particularly eloquently here, is, so there is this, I don't know enough. I've been working on getting a guest to talk about on this show. I've been working on getting a guest to talk about this concept on the show for ages now. We'll make it happen eventually. But there is this town in Attica, so like east near-ish to Athens, walking distance in the ancient world, called Brauron. And Brauron had a temple to Artemis, and again, this is very top level because I really want someone to come in and actually like break it down in detail on the show. But at Brauron, there was known to be this coming of age ceremony kind of thing that took place with young girls who were just before marriageable age. So these are like prepubescent girls who are about to become old enough that will change their life. They will become a woman because they will be married, you know, and they will have the potential to have children, whatever. But that does kind of change as a gender to them, I believe. And I think that makes sense too, because like, I mean, gender is fully a construct, right? Like, yeah, you can go into sexing these characters, but gender is a construct. And even, I mean, if we are open to those ideas, even now we could conceptualize these things as different, right? Like a girl is a very different concept from a woman, and if we wanted to, it would be pretty easy to conceptualize those as two different genders, I think, for lots of different scientific and non-scientific reasons. You know, I mean, there's a lot going on there, but I think that's really interesting. And so there's definitely something like, oh, I didn't finish, this is ADHD happening, so I'm not going to edit it, you're just going to get that moment. But the finishing bit of the Brauron thing is that this ceremony was these young girls, and part of their sort of transition to womanhood is that they would pretend to be bears. They would like crawl around like bears out by this temple and like live this very free, wild time before they became adults. And during that time, they were bears. And it's so cool and fun. And hence why I need an expert to come on the show ASAP. But I think that says a lot about what's going on or what could potentially be going on with that. So I think that's really interesting. And I think it's absolutely something that could be going on. I'm sure smarter people than me have looked into it. I don't know what kind of arguments exist out there or not, but like I can see it in the sourcing. I can see it in the mythology and just why. I mean, I can see it now. Like I said, like if we're really breaking down gender for all the different bits and pieces and what it is conceptualized as, I can see a very simple world where we conceptualize a girl as a different gender from a woman, because there are like literally countless things that make it sexually, gender-wise, like all of these things make you different. And so it's an interesting question, and I think there's absolutely something that could be going on there. I just think we don't necessarily. But again, if somebody knows about like somebody who's done work on this or whatever, like let me know, because it sounds fascinating. But I think there's a lot to be said about that, and I bet you there is. Yeah, it's a really interesting argument, and I kind of love it, and I could just keep talking about how interesting it is for a while, but I'm going to stop. So generally, thank you. And we've got another audio one.
Hi, Liv. My name is Serena. I have a question about Circe and Calypso, and how media is portraying them more and more often as goddesses who are trapped or imprisoned on the islands they live on. You see it in Madeline Miller's Circe. You see it in Percy Jackson. You see it in Epic the Musical. And I don't believe that it is in Roman mythology or Greek or mythology that has that kind of imprisonment on an island. I think the origin is a Pirates of the Caribbean movie. Do you know any agree or disagree or know of any other media? Thank you.
Serena, thank you. I know your name from the varied wilds of the internet. It's lovely to hear from you. Okay, so this is an interesting question. I don't know enough about the reception mentioned, and I don't know enough about the Pirates of the Caribbean mentioned. However, I have like a little theory about at least some kind of why that this has become a thing, which is interesting, and I've never really clocked it before. I've read Madeline Miller's Circe, but that's, I think, it out of what you said. And it's been a while. So, but I think that at the simplest and kind of most satisfying answer is that this is coming from the fact that both Calypso and Circe, less so Circe, very much so Calypso, basically only exist in the Odyssey. And obviously Circe does have these moments elsewhere, and she's in the Argonautica. She has this moment with Medea and everything, but that's very late. Like, I think, and Calypso, like, basically, if I'm not wrong, meant to triple check this, but pretty familiar. Calypso like doesn't exist elsewhere. She's in the Odyssey. She's a nymph in the Odyssey. And so I think there's something to be said about that. And then even Circe, like when she appears in other stories outside of the Odyssey, it's really only as like a stop on her island. And I can't think of anything beyond the Argonautica in terms of like epic. But obviously when she appears in the Argonautica in Apollonius, she is there because her island is serving this really explicit purpose on Medea's journey, and because they have this like relationship, they're related. And so I think that's kind of where that's coming from. So I don't know, like I think at the simplest and like, yeah, again, most satisfying answer to like where that might be coming from outside of reception is purely that these are two quite unique characters, because they really only appear in the Odyssey. And so because they only appear in the Odyssey as so linked to these islands, I don't think it's like, I actually think it's kind of a clever way of expanding their stories, because if a character is so explicitly linked to one place and only appears in like really ultimately like one or two sources, that makes a lot of sense that they're kind of like tied to that island and like locked to it, right? Because like they don't exist elsewhere in the mythology. And so I don't know, I'm not one to like say that I agree necessarily with these receptions that I've not interacted with. Like I've not listened to Epic except for that one song, which got me a lot of trouble of people misunderstanding that I said very explicitly that I was not responding to the whole thing in just that one song. But like I think that I don't know. I think it's coming from not necessarily like an explicit myth, but the very kind of overarching concept of the myths, just the fact that they literally only exist on those islands. So like, why would they not be kind of tied there? Okay, we have one more submitted question from Morgan. I'm sorry if I've neglected other people to answer the same person's question twice. I'm not sure. Either way, this is a question from Morgan, and I just think it's really nicely connected with some of the other things we've been talking about. So Morgan says, I've been studying abroad this year, and I have visited so many museums, which has been so epic, but I've seen more naked statues and paintings of Artemis or Diana than I've expected. Was this frowned upon, considering what happened to the hunter who saw her bathing? I forget his name right now. It's Actaeon. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. Also, I love your podcast. It gets me through the long drives to college. Thank you, Morgan. Okay, no, I wanted to answer this because obviously we've got this connection to Artemis, but I also think it's kind of... So, okay, I'm not an art historian, so again, like, I don't know, people have probably said smarter things than me about this, but I think it's a really interesting question, and thus, I'm going to talk about it. Because to me, what my first thought about what's happening here is time period. Honestly, time period. Because I can't think of many statues of Artemis that are like explicitly, obviously Artemis and also pre-classical Greek, or classical and before. Artemis, in my, like, I feel like I can sort of imagine the types of statues that you're talking about, because there are so many of her naked like that. And I think this is pretty heavily like Hellenistic period, and then into the Roman, and then also though, like, I don't know if you're specifying ancient or you're looking elsewhere, because there's going to be a lot of like much later. Diana became like a very, very common goddess to portray, right? And there's also, I mean, there's the Artemis of Ephesus, who's got like, people say they're like lots of boobs, but they also could be like not hot, maybe beehives, whatever, no, bees' eggs, something like that. There's lots of different interesting theories, but that doesn't really count as naked, because like she's kind of wearing a dress of boobs. It's very odd, but I can kind of picture what you mean, because there are a lot of her like kind of sexualized and naked. And so when it comes to like the Greeks in the Hellenistic period, I mean, by that point, because that's the thing, right? So if we're talking about post-classical period, we're talking about a world in which the gods were very different from the earlier time when the mythology that we all think about, like Actaeon, was being developed and created and formed into the cultural thing that it was. In that period, you know, the Iron Age, Bronze Age, up until the classical period, the gods were very like present. You were very aware. Like I think that is a period where you're like, I'm not gonna talk about seeing Artemis naked. Like, you saw what she did to Actaeon. But when we are working with a later time period and into the Hellenistic period, the gods become a little less in your face. They're a little bit more conceptual. That's when we get Apollo kind of merging with Helios to become this sun god. It's when we get Artemis as this moon goddess. Whereas before, there were so many different gods for so many different things because the world was this like really mysterious thing. But as we get later and the people are understanding things, science is developing, like they really have a much better grasp on the world itself. And so their deities are still really important, but they're a lot less of like an immediate threat to you. They're more of like what we think of as gods now, right? And so I think that's kind of what's happening here, and then a slow progression. But in the Hellenistic period specifically, that is when the artists, particularly when it comes to carving marble, like figured their shit out. The Hellenistic period is where we get the most like beautiful, yes, but it's this really like I love archaic art and I love classical. I really don't care as much about the Hellenistic period. Don't tell Michaela, she's working on a series about it right now. No, but it is really fascinating. But to me, like all the good mythology and stuff comes from before, and so I prefer those older periods. But the Hellenistic period is later. It's around when Alexander the Great's coming about, and all of those. There's lots of things happening. It's much more of like a global. Greece, not global obviously, but like just this wider idea and much more connected. It's getting closer to what we conceptualize as like a country. And so I think the gods are just a less immediate, and simultaneously the artists, the sculptors have gotten really good. And when they get really good, when they've learned, they begin learning not only how to carve the human body with accuracy and intricacy, but specifically they become really interested in movement, in details, in hair and clothing and like drapery because they're good, right? And so I think that's this point where they're like, we want to see naked people, because like being able to carve a naked body of a woman in terms of like skill and interest level is like 1,000 times better than just like she's wearing a dress. Like they do tend to have a lot of fun with the draping of clothing and fabrics, and it becomes this beautiful thing. But there's also something to be said for just like, they're like, we can carve a human body doing all of these weird moves and like really beautifully and really accurately, so we're going to. So there's something about that. But then also Diana, I don't know enough about Diana in Rome, but I believe she's not quite like Artemis in that sort of way. And again, the Romans conceptualized their gods very differently. And then we get to this point in overall art history. Again, if I'm not wrong, because I did like 2 art history classes 15 years ago. But we get to this point in art history where the religion is completely detached from these statues, right? And they're still like ritual in certain ways, I'm sure, but they become more about the statue and less about the god. And I think that's kind of what we're working with here, particularly in Rome. There's also this habit of like, you'll see if anyone traveling around these museums, particularly in Europe, but like anywhere where they have kind of like Greco-Roman stuff, you're going to find like there's this really common like thing where it'll say like Roman copy of a Hellenistic original. That's super common. The Romans kind of developed this like sculpture machine, and so you could like kind of go in and be like, I want this one, and it would be like one that they found in Greece 100 years ago, and like somebody recreates it. Now there's a lot more to it than that, but essentially it becomes this thing where it's like it's a later statue, but it's like a copy of an original. But then also like then later people, including in the Renaissance, come in and they're like, oh, Diana's kind of cool, we can paint her like they're naked with all of these animals, or all these different opportunities. So I think a lot of it is just coming from like the opportunity for art as compared to earlier, which just the innovations in art and sculpture and everything just allow that like her being naked is much more interesting. And because they've lost those connections with the very like inherent need to like please the god and their individual personalities, like there's still obviously like a lot of that going on, but like basically all to say that like there reaches a point where like the beauty and intricacy of like sculptural detail outweighs this idea that like one time Actaeon saw Artemis naked and she had him killed by his own dogs, you know? So there's just, it's a lot of time period, I think, is the main thing, but really interesting. And like, yeah, no, she's naked a lot. It's interesting. Okay. I'm almost done. I have one more voice note, and spoiler, it's not actually really a question. It is a listener who says really fucking nice stuff about me, and I'm going to play it because it makes me feel good.
Hi, Liv. My name is Brianna Borger. I wanted to just say how much I love this podcast. You have opened my eyes to such a wonderful world of Greek myth. It's something that I've always been interested in, always had a love for, but wasn't really sure where to start when it came to studying more. And so in 2020, I found this podcast and have been listening ever since. And I've listened to almost every episode. I just recently had a baby, so I fell behind a little bit, but I'm only a few episodes behind. That being said, I know that as soon as I finish everything in its entirety, I know I'll be going back and listening again to the beginning. Now, I know you say how much you despise some of your earlier podcasts because you didn't know as much, and you were still new. However, I love those episodes. They're a very wonderful way to introduce people into different myths. And then as we listen to the podcast, we get to hear things more in depth. And to me, that's a better way to learn and to really understand. So grasping like the full concept by repeating things and understanding them deeper. So I truly love the journey of this podcast and how far you've come. Just as a fellow human being, I'm so proud of you. And I love your perspective on things, love your feminist rants, your political views and things and that you discuss on this podcast. Yeah, I don't really have much of a question, but I just wanted to send you some love. Thank you for this podcast.
I mean, honestly though, like, this job is so odd. I know I say it all the time, but like, it is a weird kind of disconnect, and I often am just sort of feeling like I'm floating in this world, like working on all of this stuff and like just hoping anyone gives a shit. And you know, like this job is both the greatest thing that's ever happened to me and also, you know, it's the type of job that I literally don't ever have like a minute where I'm not thinking about it. And that can be exhausting, but when I get messages like this, whether they're in voice or in text, in email, whatever, like, honestly, they make my day, but they also just like remind me that, I mean, Q&As generally do this too, but like, I really like hearing the impact that my show has, and it just, thank you for that message. Thank you all for all of the nice things you say. And thank you all for these questions because they've been so great, and I'm so thrilled to have these voice notes now and just generally all of the questions that have been coming in. So again, I'm still working through writing this Odyssey, which means that scripted episodes are probably a little ways out. And I would love to do more Q&As. And so if you have any questions or comments or thoughts or prompts, send them in either via voice note or the form on my site. It's mythsbaby.com/questions, and you will find access to both of those things there. So thank you all so damn much. Let's talk about Myths Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Penguish is the Hermes to my Olympians, my incredible producer. Select music by Luke Chaos. The podcast is part of the Memory Collective Podcast Network, which, I don't know, things are happening, or we're trying to, I promise. And a website is like imminent. I think I'm going to be able to launch it at the end of August, early September, and we're going to have merch, and it's going to be good. And it's worth it. It's going to be worth it. So stay tuned, and if you want to receive the newsletter whenever it is that I make it to announce all of these fun things, sign up at mythsbaby.com/newsletter. I will also have information about the next group trip, which we're doing something a little bit different and still figuring out. We're probably going to do the same thing again with the other trips. I don't know. I'm just sort of like poking at this thought now because I need to actually prepare what I'm going to say to you all. But stay tuned for more information about the next group trips that we're going to be doing to Greece. And signing up for that newsletter is going to be the best way to receive all of that. Thank you all so goddamn much for listening. It means the whole fucking world to me. And messages like this and questions like this are what keep me going. So, send them in. And comment on Spotify. Those make me so fucking happy too. And I try to reply, and I always like them when I see them. And just please, thank you so fucking much. I am Liv, and I love this shit.